First thing you do is enter into a letter of intent with a buyer or a prospective buyer. A letter of intent is a non-binding agreement. However, it sets the stage for what's typically known as a definitive agreement. It's a non-binding in the sense that the parties agree upon sales price, employees, things of that nature, but eventually that changes as the process continues. So the letter of intent, although it's non-binding, there are components of it that can be binding. For example, non-disclosure components of it. And although it's a non-binding document, parties will sometimes look back to that agreement once they're finalizing their definitive agreements. We start with the letter of intent and then move on to the due diligence part of the transaction. The due diligence part of the transaction is where the potential buyer will start to try to figure out what it is that they're buying. They'll typically ask for a lot of information that you may or may not have, so it's really critical for companies that might be interested in selling to basically get their house in order, to get all their documents lined up, to get all their agreements that they have in one place that's easy to find. After you finish due diligence, the next phase is where you go about drafting and preparing the definitive agreements. The really critical parts of that, aside from the sales price obviously, is the reps and warranties and the covenants that the parties are going to agree to post-closing. There could be a little bit of a tug-of-war between the two sides, where one party, the buyer, will like extensive representations, warranties, and the seller would try to minimize those. So typically that's a very strong negotiating point as you're drafting the definitive agreements. The other parts have to do with covenants not to compete and things of that nature are typically negotiated this time. So once you finish the process, you get to prepare for closing. One of the key components to post-closing is going to involve how the seller is able to obtain the most of their sales price. And sometimes this is considered an earn-out. So as you finish the definitive agreements and you're going towards closing, the parties focus on issues such as earn-outs and covenants that are going to come into play after you've closed, so those post-closing covenants. They can get very hairy sometimes, and typically once you actually do get to closing and you look forward, a buyer would like the seller to help with transition issues. And some of the things that a seller can anticipate would be some potential issues coming about by how the earn-out is calculated post-closing. I like that every transaction is so different. It's a great process for me to be involved in helping educate the client on how to prepare for sale, what happens during the sales process, and then what happens after you close. Because a lot of times there's some post-closing obligations that the seller may not have thought about ahead of time.